The workhouse is located in the town of Southwell, Nottinghamshire, England, and is owned and operated by the National Trust, which opened to the public in 2002. It is the most complete 19th-century workhouse in existence. Built in 1824 as a refuge for the destitute and was designed to house around 160 inmates who lived and worked in a segregated environment, and was in use until the 1980s. These buildings have witnessed over 160 years of social care and attitudes towards the poor. Behind every door is a story. Let's step back into the past and explore the experience of those who lived, worked, or were treated here. Reverend John Thomas Besher was a clergyman and a magistrate, but is probably best known as a social reformer. Born to parents from Cork, Ireland, in 1770 he moved to Southwell in 1792 after being educated at Oxford and becoming ordained as a priest. Looking after the poor was a national social issue throughout the Elizabethan and mid-Victorian years. To try and resolve this, Besher and other social reformers devised the workhouse test, the rule that no relief be granted to able-bodied people without them entering a workhouse. It was Besher's idea that local parishes combine funds and build a workhouse to house the destitute rather than each parish supporting individuals with food, fuel and clothing. Up to 158 inmates at a time, from 62 parishes, entered this building as a last resort. Besher's view was that workhouses should be a deterrent to ensure that only the truly destitute would submit themselves to such a harsh regime. It was also intended to achieve a moral improvement, with the poor providing for themselves if at all possible. Adults were divided into categories: those unable to work, called blameless, and those capable of work but unemployed, considered idle and profligate able-bodied. They were further subdivided into men and women, and children were kept separate. Each group lived in different areas, meaning families couldn't meet. Inmates were fed, clothed, and housed, and some were made to work. Children received a form of education. Besher's ideas were based on the social welfare schemes that evolved after the Old Poor Law of 1601. Their revolutionary but strict system attracted much attention. The Poor Law Commission used their model to inform the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, known as the New Poor Law. Hundreds of workhouses were set up across the country as part of a national government system. If a pauper had no choice but to enter the workhouse, they would go to the gate and ask to be admitted. They would be searched by the master or matron, according to their sex. Their clothes and any personal items were removed and kept aside. They had to take a bath and were given a numbered set of workhouse clothing. The conditions were harsh and treatment was cruel, with families divided, forcing children to be separated from their parents, with each going to their own section. The larger part of this room was first a cowhouse, then, in 1837, a temporary schoolroom. A small room at the back was the dead room, where the bodies of those who died in the workhouse were kept until their parish collected them for burial. The paupers had small exercise yards in front of the house. These larger rear yards were workspaces. Men had regular jobs in the garden or house, but if nothing was needed doing, they were kept working anyway by breaking rocks or picking ochre. These are the male toilets. Able-bodied male day room. The men were kept busy working. Oakum picking was an unpleasant and tiresome task. It involved separating old rope by hand, until it could be broken down into individual fibers, which would involve untwisting the rope into strands. It was a long, slow, dreary job and very tough on the fingers. Time spent in this room would focus on meals and occasionally extra work carried out, like the paupers lime washing the walls frequently. If the aged and infirm could make it downstairs, then this day room and the yard outside would be where they spend most of their time. Diversions and comforts were few. The clerk's office. The role of the clerk was well paid. As the agent of the guardians, he had more power than the master and a good understanding of the rules. This room feels cozier. It is small, easy to heat and well maintained. The walls are plastered too, giving a higher quality finish. The master had lots of daily paperwork to complete in his office. However, this room also served as a sitting room, dining room, and staff room. The cellar beneath the house was used for storing food and drink. A meat safe was found in the cellars when the National Trust began conserving the workhouse in 1997. Meat safes were used before fridges became available and affordable. The galvanized metal mesh would help to keep perishable food fresher for longer and keep out insects. In the scullery, dirty pots and dishes were scraped and scoured, and water was boiled for countless other cleaning tasks. Inmates cleaned the utensils, and were stored in the kitchen or day room. In the kitchen, where all the meals were made. Bread and gruel being the main diet, gruel was made from 550 milliliters boiled milk, 20 grams oatmeal. The Board of Guardians met in this room regularly to make decisions. They would also hear the reports of the workhouse officers, such as the master. This room was also used for prayers and service on Sundays and holy days. Aged and infirm male sleeping ward. While the very sick would have been in the infirmary, some of the 13 to 15 aged and infirm paupers in here had chronic illness or mental issues. Up to 20 men may have once slept here, in a mixture of double and single beds. Able-bodied paupers were expected to work, and were up from 6:30 a.m. to 8 p.m. If a pauper left the workhouse without permission, they could be prosecuted for the theft of the cloths on their backs. Each block of the workhouse has 2 floors of dormitories. The house was designed for 158 paupers, at times far fewer, at other times many more. This room was left as it was found. It holds clues pointing to the reality of workhouse life. Aged and infirm male sleeping ward. Further beds were provided for the aged and infirm paupers. No curtains were provided. Fresh air and light were considered highly important for health, and windows were always open whatever the weather. Children's sleeping ward. Children up to the age of 2 slept in the women's dormitories with their mothers, and might do so up to age 7. Older children and those without mothers slept in here. The master and matron had to live on site and furnish their own living quarters. They probably put up their own curtains.
I grew up in Southwell and became schoolmistress at the Workhouse in 1857. The Poor Law Board doubted whether I was competent for the office, because I had no formal training or experience and I was young. I proved them wrong. All my reports filed by the inspectors show me to be satisfactory or pretty fair. I have full responsibility for the children, and since the resignation of the schoolmaster in 1860, I must teach the boys too. I will become the longest-serving schoolmistress here and only resigned in 1873 because of my marriage to William Rumford. A schoolmistress must be single.
Some workhouses only focused on reading, but later most felt a basic education that included being able to write. It would ensure the children were able to get suitable employment and not end up back in the workhouse. Although both boys and girls were taught writing in copybooks and on slates, learning arithmetical tables, and reading the Bible, the boys were also employed in gardening while the girls were taught sewing, knitting, and housework. Aged and infirm female sleeping ward. This bedsit room has been recreated as it was in the 1970s. The sick and a portion of the infirm moved here from the workhouse. With greater numbers and improved care, a paid nurse was needed to supervise. Paid and pauper nurses cared for a huge range of conditions, from arthritis to cancer, tuberculosis to dementia, and even epilepsy. But this was not a hospital. Victorian elderly or chronically sick were normally cared for at home, sometimes visited by a doctor. Workhouse infirmaries provided substitute care for those without families to nurse them or to pay the doctor. In the 1871 infirmary, male and female patients were separated as in the workhouse. This was one of the 2 wards for women, and probably contained 5 beds. After 1948, this and the former hospital next door became known as an old people's home. In 1962, male residents were moved away to a purpose-built home. The hospital, now Minster View, became a specialized unit for women with conditions such as dementia. This building was renamed Furbeck House and cared for women needing less intensive help. The last resident left in the late 1980s when the local authority found a modern care home. The workhouse closed in 1989 and was later taken over by the National Trust.